Okay, everyone, thank you so much for coming. I'm Pete Davis, a 2L here at Harvard Law School, and the chair of the Harvard Law Forum, the longest-running American Law School speaker series, once home of Jimmy Carter, JFK, Whoopi Goldberg, Fidel Castro, Vince McMahon, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Beautiful speakers we've had here at the Harvard Law Forum. And now we have some wonderful speakers here today. We're called here today because the mission this year of the Harvard Law Forum is to draw attention to our school's mission statement, which is to educate leaders who contribute to the advancement of justice and the well-being of society, a supremely important cause in the advancement of justice and bettering the well-being of society is prison education. For 100 years since the dawn of the extension school movement, universities have claimed to be opening themselves up to the community, not just being resources for people inside here on campus. And prison education is a huge part of opening up our college to the community. And we're here to remind us why Harvard should fight for prison reform. We have a wonderful speaker here today and a wonderful person introducing it. Our speaker here today that we've called here is Max Kenner. He is the founder and executive director of the Bard Prison Initiative, which is one of the leading programs providing college educations and college degrees to incarcerated Americans. He started the program while he was an undergraduate at Bard College. So a dream as a student at the college who saw a cause, decided to make something of it, and 16 years later of growing it, institutionalizing it, spreading it all around the country and the world, it's now a world-renowned program. It's copied at multiple colleges, and it was recently highlighted in Bill Clinton's book, Giving, as one of the great examples of an initiative here in the country.
So thank you, Vince, and thank you, Pete. It is certainly extremely flattering to be invited to be here with all of you this afternoon. And, you know, in extending the invitation to be here with you, I think, you know, it was the intention of the Law Forum and of Pete's to ask a broader question specific to Harvard, but one that to us at BPI can be generalized nationwide, right? And that is, what can or should the role of our great universities be in American life in the 21st century, right? And we have to remember at all points that all of our human institutions, all of our social institutions, college universities, our institutions of justice and punishment, our museums, galleries, arts institutions, our whole social service establishment, right? All of this superstructure was built to address the problems as we understood them, or as decision makers understood them 80 or 100 or 130 years ago, right? And so when speaking to undergraduates, or graduate students, or law students, right, it's so important for us to convey the reality that there is no way to address the problems we face in the 21st century, the problems you've been bequeathed as a generation, right? Radical inequality, mass extinction, nuclear proliferation, the refugee crises that will only get worse, right? Catastrophic climate change. There's no way that we can address any of these problems if we, A, utilize institutions that are built to address problems of 20th century rather than 21st century, number one. And number two, accept what we're told is going to be possible, right? Because conventional means will lead to conventional outcomes, and our idea of what's possible won't address the challenges we face, okay? So that's the basic premise of how we go about our work, and we'll return to it. And I want to really emphasize that relationship between you or any of us as individuals and the institutions, rather, that we live and work within. Okay? So the work we do at BPI can be challenging to talk about in a especially pithy or concise kind of way because it happens at the cross-section, at the confluence of two of our great social crises in this American moment. And those are, number one, access, opportunity to a decent education, cost associated with an education, right? And the relationship between education and American democratic life on the one hand, right? And on the other, this thing that we've come to call by shorthand as mass incarceration. Right? And it's important to remember, right, that the term mass incarceration itself is a relatively new thing. A few years before, it was, the prison industrial complex, and then it existed for 25 or 30 years before that without a name, without really being recognized in any way, right? So just backing up, we'll describe that first, talk about education second, and then talk about how they intersect with one another. Mass incarceration, essentially at its core, first of all, is this phenomenon where over the last 30 or 40 years, we in the United States have come to incarcerate more and more people for longer and longer periods of time, very often for smaller and smaller infractions of the law at younger and younger ages, right? And as we've done that, we've done something extraordinary, which is we have gone out of our way to make those institutions worse, right? Which is that is a intersection of two phenomena that's worth dwelling on, right? We have divested from schools and college universities, placed all this money into institutions of punishment, made jails and prisons the central public institutions of a generation, right? Made them really important, the fabric of American life, and then, after making them important, gone out of our way to make them bad, right? Because for a generation, they were certainly criticized at the time, but American jails and prisons were filled with things that were designed to try to improve the lives of the people within them, right? And the irony that as we made them bigger, as we made them more central to who we are as a people, that we decided to make them worse, make them more hopeless, make them certain to be places which returned individuals to our communities who were almost, faced with impossible challenges to be parents or neighbors or voters or taxpayers or any of those things. We should not, in my view, ever lose sight of that. And then, we all know it as Americans. We all intuit it. It almost doesn't need to be said, but it's also important to remember that this thing, mass incarceration, is in no way neutral. That is to say, the word mass itself in mass incarceration does not only refer to the size of the system, even though it is the largest system of its kind in the history of humankind, right? But the mass doesn't refer to the fact that it's giant. The mass refers to the way that it zeroes into certain pockets of society and explodes that size in those certain pockets of society. So to give you an example, there are urban blocks in 4 of the 5 boroughs of New York City where we now have come to realize we spend $1 million per block incarcerating residents of those blocks, right? So again, it goes without saying, but the overwhelming majority of people impacted by this system are young men of color from certain neighborhoods or certain communities, right? And when we think about how we got here, taking the long view, right, from 30 or 40 years ago when there were, some 200 odd some people in prison in the United States, I think we have to face the reality that somewhere along the way, our parents' generation adopted a kind of cynicism about younger people, or even a fear of younger people, which somehow made them invest all these resources and all this time and all this money and all this commitment to the institutions of punishment rather than specifically those of learning, right? Why would they do that? And I think we feel, certainly, that all of that was in some way a reaction to the relative success and failures of the Civil Rights Revolution. Right? But I also want to say that, we don't want to caricature that reaction too much, right? It's very easy to say that was a cynicism or a fear that was utilized only by reactionaries, or only by law enforcement, or only by people who, would make a profit from this, or, what have you. And I think that's incorrect. And at BPI, I think we believe that that cynicism was also adopted and really implemented by leaders of our best colleges and universities. And that those individuals and this establishment faces a really similar crisis of confidence. That what we do in higher education and what we say every day is so valuable about the humanities, about the arts, about mathematical literacy, or a sense of the natural world, or democratic engagement, right? That all that stuff that we say is central to democratic life and why we pay for big universities like this, I think the leaders in higher education came to believe their opponents' rhetoric that somehow that stuff was only relevant to certain kinds of people who typically end up at these elite institutions, right? And we have to remember that the way we do college access, the way we do college admission, provide college opportunity, so often, these institutions are filled by people who knew from the time they could walk that they would go to this kind of institution. Their parents did and their grandparents did, right? And it's ironic because throughout American history, going back to Thomas Jefferson, right? American democracy is developed with this idea that people evolve over time, right? Contra to systems of education in Europe, or most of the rest of the world, frankly, right? Where people at age 15 or 12 or 10 sometimes, right, are diagnosed as, this person will be an engineer, and this person will be a janitor, this person will, whatever, right, be an educator. Right? In America, we committed ourselves very early on and thought it was essential to the democratic experiment that we let people evolve and learn and find themselves over time. Right? And yet, we have, in contrast to that, in a supposedly Christian country, right, also become the place where we have allowed ourselves to define people over extraordinary periods of time exclusively and totally by the worst thing they've ever done. Right? So it's an example of how I think we cannot parse out neatly this extraordinary investment that we have made in punishment over the last generation in American life and our disregard for education in democratic life, right? They are one and the same, right? So, at Bard, we set out to try to address this problem at a moment that, Vince referred to. There was college opportunity virtually in every state and federal prison in the United States, and then there was none with the Clinton Crime Bill of 1994 implemented in 1995, right? And, you know, when we thought of all the resources we have at a college or a university and how we would engage an issue, you know, we did something that I think is actually unusual certainly among sort of undergraduate politics, right? Which is we didn't organize a protest or, you know, badger elected officials or tell, you know, senior administrators at the college that, you know, they weren't ethical or something. You know what I'm talking about? What we suggested, in fact, was that what if we, as an institution, as a college, simply work to do a better job at the thing we're singularly qualified to do, which is teach, right? To engage students, maybe of a slightly different variety, in precisely the same way we do undergraduates of, you know, on campus or anywhere else. And, you know, that is an unusual approach, right? Because very often, whenever anyone, and we'll give other examples of this later on in the afternoon, you know, talks about going to unconventional places or to prisons, so often it's with a sense that we as outsiders, or me as an individual, unqualified though I may be, knows exactly what's good for this other person that I don't understand, right? You know, on the right side of the political spectrum, it's God, or it is, you know, vocational education, or it's teaching people over, you know, spend the rest of their lives saying, you know, sorry, 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 sorry all the time, you know what I mean? Or on the left side of the political spectrum, you know, we shouldn't generalize or be bigoted, but, you know, you'll excuse me. On the left side of the political spectrum, it is, you know, we should only train people to resist mass incarceration, or do racial theory, or, you know, political activism of some kind, or whatever, right? And our disposition is the opposite. It's to bring the full breadth of a liberal education to a place where it otherwise isn't, and see what students do with it themselves. So, what is essential to keep in mind as you watch or think about something like that is that the students you saw in that film are not somehow analogous to, they're not like, they're not representative of, they are precisely the same people that the last generation of this country's most distinguished and most accomplished social scientists defined as things like super predators, right? And that our most influential decision makers, again, invested all this money and all this resources, not in cultivating, not in fulfilling, but to physically keep away from us, to remove from us, and to close off not only from ourselves, but from opportunities for themselves for the future, at the costs of untold billions of dollars. Right? And we should remember that the accomplishments that these students achieve now on a regular basis, right? We've been around at BPI for 15 years, 16 years, are still, to this day, if you check with the professionals, the experts, the social scientists who study outcomes in criminal justice, or you go down Brattle Street to the education school here at Harvard. The things that our students accomplish academically in either of these realms are meant to be impossible, right? People return to prison at rates, depending how you measure it, or where, or at what age, or whatever, between 30 or 40 or 60% of the time. And BPI alumni return to prison, between, depending how you measure it, depending on the age, depending on how much time we've had with them, between 2 and 2.5 and 4% of the time. Right? You know, we have all kinds of expectations that we don't talk about in American life about who can achieve what, right? There's no more widely accepted, you know, superstition, maybe outside of astrology, you know, in American life, than this bigoted idea of the changes over generations about who can succeed studying math, right? We have deeply ingrained ideas about what ethnic groups do well studying mathematics. And that's sort of crazy. But even the experts, people who study this stuff, say that, you know, once we hit a certain age, as our brains develop, we lose the capacity to learn algebra, right? Yet we have now generations of students who come to prison as adults, algebraically illiterate, start with remedial math, do pre-calculus, calculus, and go on. You know, a few months ago we had our second bachelor's degree graduation in a row. Between a third and half of those graduates were majors in mathematics, doing senior theses, research theses at the same level as, you know, Bard students. You know, it's a private liberal arts college, competitive get into, you know. We don't think as highly as ourselves as Harvard University does about itself, but, you know, we're into it. Writing math senior thesis, the same level of students that come from the best private public high schools, whatever. Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, coming from East Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, all over the world, right? This is stuff that we're told is not meant to be possible, right? And when our students are released from prison, not only do they not go back to prison, which we find to be an incredibly aggressively condescending metric by which to measure either our student success, right? But they go back not only as neutral non-liabilities to their families and their communities, but they're working in the human services, right? They're taxpayers, they're better parents, they're neighbors, right? They're working in community-based organizations with so-called youth at risk, right? They're working in the field of public health, right? They're working in business. They're working in the arts, just like graduates of this college will, right, in the future. So, you know, before wrapping up, I think there are a few historical analogies that are worthwhile here. The first is, you know, when we think of how any group of people can defy expectations in such an extraordinary way, you know, it begs a question. And I would, you know, just venture to say that there have always, through American history, been groups of people who've taken better advantage of a little bit of educational opportunity, a little bit of access than, most of the rest of us, right? The group that has done that throughout American history, consistently from the 18th century to today, are immigrants, right? Always. Achieve more quickly. 80 years ago, the best colleges in the United States were community colleges in Brooklyn and Queens because they were filled with people from Eastern Europe who were barred from institutions like this one, right? And over the course of the 20th century, veterans returning home from foreign wars democratized and transformed the landscape of American higher education. And most of all, and we never ever talk or hear about it, there's no group of people in the American past who achieved more quickly, more radically, at the remedial level, at the advanced level, than the generation of two of Americans who experienced emancipation. Right? So there is, in our view, a long-lasting relationship between American education and American freedom. And when we talk about what the role of colleges or universities might be in American life, yes, we want to engage everyone, and yes, we want to engage people in different circumstances. But we also should be in the business of finding the people that will make the most of it. And too often, the people that make the most of it are typically the more persecuted or the least popular people among us. So we bear the burden in leadership of college universities of finding and reaching those individuals. When we talk about how we're going to reform or how we're going to change criminal justice in the United States in a way that we can be proud of, and why something like education has to be at the center of it, I think it's important to look back skeptically at moments in the American past when we have achieved the most. If you were a radical abolitionist in the 1850s who truly hated American slavery, right, and would dedicate your life to destroying it, and someone came to you and said that by 1864, 1865, the institution would be destroyed, abolished, right? That would be an impossibly good outcome. Impossible to imagine, impossible to achieve. And yet it happened. And yet whoever told you that could also tell you that by 1870 or 1878 or 1880, there would be labor conditions of the South really would not be that radically different than they were in the antebellum period. Right? And if you were building the New Deal, right, and someone told you you would be successful building the broadest, deepest middle class that humankind had ever known, right, that would be overwhelmingly exciting. But you wouldn't know you were also building systems of segregation that would define American life and divide Americans by color in a way that would last longer and than the prosperity of that middle class. And lastly, if you were a freedom rider in 1863 or 1864, and someone described to you the level of success that you would have in destroying Jim Crow over the next 10 or 20 years, you would be completely overwhelmed with joy. And then if that person told you that 50 years later, there would be more African American men in the United States without the right to vote than there were at the signature of the Voting Rights Act, what would you have to say? So, just wrapping up, we have the privilege, we have a very good relationship in New York with the Archdiocese, and we've, spent some time with the Cardinal there, Cardinal Tim Dolan, who said something that we always repeat in ending these talks, and that is, in his view, he said the Church classically believes that God continues His creation through education. Right? And it's worth thinking about. And I think we should think not only that the reality that that's true with individuals, but with some work and commitment, institutions can too. So, thank you.